Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scott Bertram.
We continue a series of episodes from presentations delivered at Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence seminars. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offers educators the opportunity to deepen their content knowledge and refine their skills in the classroom. These one-day conferences are hosted during the academic year in cities across the nation and feature presentations by Hillsdale College faculty, K-12 office staff, and leaders in the Hillsdale network of member schools. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series exploring the art of teaching a variety of subjects. To learn more about upcoming events, visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu.
My name is Emily Williams. As Eric said, I am currently teaching 8th and 9th grade science at Kootenai Classical Academy, which is up in northern Idaho in a town called Post Falls. And you may think that because I am up here at a conference for classical education, speaking to a room of classical educators, that I am an expert in classical education. But I guess the joke is on all of us this morning, because I am not. Although this is my 18th year teaching, this is only my 4th year teaching classically. I spent the first 14 years of my career teaching in the New York City public school system, which is about as far away from teaching classically in Idaho as you can get. My friends in New York still think I live in Iowa. And when they are like, hey, how's Iowa going? I'm like, it's so good. But I can stand up here and confidently say that I have learned more in this past 4 years teaching classically and working with classical educators than I ever did in my 14 years teaching in New York City. And honestly, in my own 18 years of my formal instruction in public schools. And so I'm really excited to be here with you all today. I'm very passionate about the work that we do, and I'm excited to share with you what I've learned so far. So whenever I present to other teachers, I really like to give you some practical things that you can start incorporating into your practice, like the next time you're working with students. And I promise we're going to get there today in this talk. But I think before we do get to these practical ways that we can help students, we need to kind of understand what we mean when I say the modern world. So the title of this talk is Teaching Science Classically in the Modern World. So what is this modern world? And specifically, how has education affected it? And how can education affect its future? So as Americans, we differ in so many ways. But there's one thing that most people in our modern world have in common. They've attended a traditional public school. For the past 40 years, about 90% of the American population has gone to a public school from kindergarten through 12th grade. So I think it's fair to say that the approach that public schools have to education has greatly influenced the modern world in which we live. Most of the people we're going to come into contact with in our roles as classical educators have been to a public school. So this is students, this is teachers, this is parents, administrators, school board members. Most of them have had some contact with public education. And so I think it's important to understand really what the intended goals and the design of public education is, because I think it has shaped our modern world in ways that some of us might not even realize. So to deepen your confidence in me as an expert in classical education and as qualified to be standing up here today, I'm going to start my talk about classical education by talking about public education. So please stay with me, though. Sometimes this happens in the classroom, like I'll start going somewhere and the students are like, where are you going? What's happening? I'm like, just stick with me. I promise by the end it will come together, and hopefully that will happen today. So I think the best way to kind of understand American public education is to go back to the turn of the 20th century and to understand kind of this progressive era that was sweeping the nation at that time. Now, I am not a historian, which will be evident by my explanation of the progressive era right now. But essentially, kind of my understanding of it is, we had the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, we had this wave of industrialization and immigration and urbanization, and people in America, a lot of people in America were like, we got to change it all. We have to turn our back on the past. We have a big, bright, beautiful, modern America to build. And so we're going to look forward at the future rather than kind of learning our lessons from the past. And out of this kind of forward-thinking spirit arose the architect of our public school system, the father of modern American education, John Dewey. John Dewey he's fascinating. He wrote so much about so much. And so he makes very clear kind of his philosophy and his understandings of what the American school system, what a progressive American school system should look like. And so in all of his writing, there are kind of three main ideas that come out that I think were fundamental in his design of the school system that is currently what we're calling public education in our country. So the first thing is that John Dewey was a pragmatist. So he was fundamentally interested in the use of things. And so he had a very utilitarian view for ideas and for pretty much everything in the world. He was also a naturalist, so he strictly believed that there was a material, physical explanation for everything important in the world, including human nature, and that experimentation was the only way to uncover what was true about the world. And then also he was a big proponent of democracy, but I think we need to understand what John Dewey means when he says democracy. John Dewey kind of viewed the fundamental unit of democracy as the group rather than the individual. So to have this big, bright, modern, democratic America, we really need to focus on a well-socialized population that would get along well in this democratic future. So these beliefs and many, many more converge to create Dewey's vision of this new progressive public education system. And essentially, he turned his back, the progressive that he was, on the traditional way that students had learned and the traditional approach to education, which I kind of think of as like classical. We had the teachers who were essentially passing the torch of human heritage and human understanding and knowledge from one generation to the other. So students learned from the past how to live in the future. But Dewey's system that he designed kind of turned away from that. And he believed that the purpose of education was the proper socialization of the student. And so essentially what this looks like is we would take students, we would put them in a school community. The students would act however they would normally act. And then they would get feedback from their school community, and that's how they learned, from the feedback that they received in the present of their school community. One of the great things about John Dewey is that, as I said, he was a prolific writer. So we don't have to do a lot of interpreting to understand his purposes and his idea for what education in America should look like. He says it very clearly. So in an essay he wrote in 1897 called My Pedagogic Creed, he explains his core beliefs about education. I'm going to quote a few excerpts from this essay. I believe that the true center of correlation on the school subjects is not science, nor literature, nor history, nor geography, but the child's own social activities. I believe once more that history is of educative value insofar as it presents phases of social life and growth. It must be controlled by reference to social life. When taken simply as history, it is thrown into the distant past and becomes dead and inert. I believe that the only true education comes through the stimulation of the child's powers by the demands of the social situations in which he finds himself. Through these demands, he is stimulated to act as a member of a unity, to emerge from his original narrowness of action and feeling, and to conceive of himself from the standpoint of the welfare of the group to which he belongs. End quote. So very clearly, Dewey here is stating that the shift in education that he envisioned would purposefully turn away from the traditional disciplines of literature, history, math, and science, and towards the creation of students who, as he says, prioritize the welfare of the group to which he belongs. In 1898, Dewey wrote another essay called The Primary Education Fetish, in which he expands on his ideas regarding the role reading and writing should play in primary education. In his essay, he writes, and I quote, "There is, however, a false educational God whose idolaters are legion and whose cult influences the entire educational system. This is language study, the study not of foreign language, but of English, not in higher, but in primary education. It is almost an unquestioned assumption of educational theory and practice both, that the first 3 years of a child's school life shall be mainly taken up with learning to read and write his own language. If we add to this learning or a certain amount of numerical combinations, we have the pivot around which primary education swings. However, to educate on the basis of the past is like adapting an organism to an environment which no longer exists. The individual is stultified, if not disintegrated, and the course of progress is blocked. My proposition is that conditions, social, industrial, and intellectual, have undergone such a radical change that the time has come for a thoroughgoing examination of the emphasis put upon linguistic work in elementary education." End quote. So to fully prepare students for participation in America's future, Dewey argued that all learning must come from the present, as the past was such a different world that it can no longer apply to our modern students, even to the point of saying that teaching young children to read, write, and do math was simply too old-fashioned to be valuable in the new system he was building. I think that the historian Christopher Dawson accurately summarized Dewey's approach to education when he wrote, quote, "In his views, our purpose for education is not the communication of knowledge, but the sharing of social experience so that the child becomes integrated into the democratic community. He believed that morals were essentially social and pragmatic, and that any attempt to subordinate education to transcendent values or dogmas ought to be resisted." End quote. So after starting his lab schools in Chicago and being aligned with the progressive spirit of the time, Dewey's approach to education was adopted wholesale and has had its effect on public education ever since. So I did some math preparing for this talk, and I realized that between my own public education and my career as a public school teacher, that I have spent 85% of my life involved directly in public education. So in addition to making me feel very old when I realize that, considering the time that I've spent teaching in New York, I do feel somewhat well qualified to tell you that without a shadow of a doubt, that Dewey's vision for education is being realized in this country. When I was earning my master's in secondary education, my classes focused primarily on, student-centered instruction and making our lessons culturally relevant, and having students work together to solve what are called real-world problems. I was encouraged to create self-guided projects for students to work on collaboratively, and discouraged from giving students formal assessments so that I could understand where they were in their learning. We were trained on how to make our classes relevant to students by discussing pop culture or current events in the class. And never once did I receive any support in direct instruction or even the history of my discipline, science. This was never addressed. And all of this, now that I'm a classical educator, this sounds like terrible. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. But like at the time, I bought it, like hook, line, and sinker. I was like in. I didn't know any better. There was never like an alternative way to teach that had been presented to me. I had gone to public schools. I was doing okay. So I went in full force. And then, the confirmation that this is a great way to educate students is all around us. When I was writing my master's thesis on, of all things, inquiry-based instruction in the urban high school classroom, I read hundreds of studies singing the praises of social learning and student-centered instruction. There is certainly no shortage of peer-reviewed papers that provide evidence of the extraordinary benefits of Dewey's system of education. However, as the years in my career in New York City went on, I began to see some cracks in this foundation. The number of books the students in my high school had to read diminished by the year. And in the last 3 years I taught in New York City, students weren't required to read one book. Slowly but surely, my pedagogy was evaluated more on how much I connected the content to the students' lives, rather than how much science they were actually learning. The expectations slowly became lower and lower, and as the years went on, I saw my students become less and less capable, literate, and joyful. So much has been written about how poorly American students do on the educational stage. We spend more on education than almost every country in the world, yet we are barely able to break the top 30 in literacy and math scores. And, when we talk about why, it's, the reasons are often blamed. It's like, schools just need more money, or we need better teachers, or, the curriculum isn't relevant enough. The standards, we need to change the standards. But I think the problem is so much deeper than this. And I think it's the very design of the system and the fact that it completely ignores the truth of human nature that is the problem. So this progressive approach to education has had countless effects on what we're calling the modern world. I mean, I could probably talk about this for 10 hours, but I'm not going to put you through that torture. So I'm only going to discuss 2 of the many effects that this has had on our modern world, from my view. But before I delve into these, I think it's really important to understand that, these problems that I'm going to discuss, they're not unique to us in this modern world. I think that we have our own flavor of them, but these are problems that humans have been dealing with ever since we started talking about human nature. Nor do I think that all public educators and all public schools around the country contribute to these problems. Nor do I think these problems are shared by every single member of our modern world. There is so much good in our modern world, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But we have some problems that I think we need to air before we can start talking about what we can do about them. So the first influence the progressive model of education has had on our modern world is that we don't understand why we learn. We have no meaningful purpose for education. We've been taught that the reason we learn is for what it can do for us, rather than what it will do to us. We learn for the external benefits an education can provide, rather than because we believe that learning shapes our internal minds and souls. One of the people who had a tremendous impact on the shift in my thinking about the world is the social critic and professor of education, Neil Postman, who is best known for his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And in another one of his books, The End of Education, he argues that the reason public schools are failing is because they fail to provide students with meaningful purposes for engaging in learning. And he calls these meaningless purposes gods with little g's. And he spends the first part of his book talking about why these gods with little g's have failed. The following is a quote from The End of Education, where he is discussing the flaws in using the promise of economic success as a reason for learning. Quote, "So many believe it to be the preeminent reason for schooling. It may properly go by the name of the God of economic utility. As its name suggests, it is a passionless God, cold and severe, but it makes a promise and not a trivial one. Addressing the young, it offers a covenant of sorts with them. If you will pay attention in school and do your homework and score well on tests and behave yourself, you will be rewarded with a well-paying job when you are done. It is the driving idea that the purpose of schooling is to prepare children for competent entry into the economic life of a community. But for all its widespread popularity, the God of economic utility is impotent to create satisfactory reasons for schooling. Any education that is mainly about economic utility is far too limited to be useful, and in any case, so diminishes the world that it mocks one's humanity." I remember reading this, and I was sitting on my couch in my tiny apartment in New York City, and I sat there and I thought about all the times a student had raised his hand in class and asked, "Why were we learning this? Miss, why do I have to know this?" And I always had answered with something exactly along the lines of what Postman wrote. Without school, you'll never be economically successful. How will you get a job if you don't go to school? And this answer never satisfied the students. And now I understood why. Because ultimately, economic success is no reason to persevere through learning. And to boot, when we offer them this reason, we're mocking their humanity. And I can't argue with that. And this is why, this is why people don't like school. Because chasing a diploma so that you can have some prerequisite for some opportunity that might make you some money one day is not a meaningful reason to engage in education. But it is certainly very reflective of Dewey's utilitarian, community-based mentality. So because we aren't giving our students meaningful reasons to engage in schooling, no one really understands why humans learn in the first place, so that's not good. But we're going to get even worse, everyone. We're going to get into our second effect, and this is a big one. This is one that we talk about a lot in our modern world, which is that we do not understand what truth is. So for thousands of years, humans agreed in an objective moral truth, one which reflected reality eternally and universally, around which education and our lives should revolve. But Dewey's rejection of the past and belief that values are best formulated in the present has changed that, and we now live in a world where moral truths are believed to be completely relativistic and formed by the current situations. The problem with this, obviously, is that there is objective truth, certainly as far as human nature is concerned. There is undoubtedly a good way to live life, just as there are undoubtedly bad choices that we can make. However, in this modern world of you do you and the pressure to be politically correct and avoid judgment or avoid offending people, many of us have lost touch with this. And the result is we're very disconnected from the truths that are larger than ourselves and that have eternally governed humanity. And instead, we believe that whatever understanding we have derived from the present moment to be the solid ground on which we should stand. We are, as a colleague of mine puts it, unmoored. In his book, The Abolition of Man, which is essentially a way better treatment of everything I'm saying in this speech today, C.S. Lewis discusses the shift in educators turning away from moral objective truth, which he calls the Tao, and towards social conditioning. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis writes, quote, "In the older systems, both the kind of man the teachers wished to produce and their motives for producing him were prescribed by the Tao, a norm to which the teachers themselves were subject and from which they claimed no liberty to depart. They did not cut men into some pattern they had chosen. They handed on what they had received. They initiated the young neophyte into the mystery of humanity, which overarched him and them alike. It was but old birds teaching young birds to fly. This will be changed. Values are not mere conditional natural phenomena. Judgments of value are to be produced in the pupil as a part of conditioning. Whatever Tao there is will be the product, not the motive, of education." End quote. This approach to education essentially robs students of the chance to understand their own human nature. Speaking of the effect this has on students, Lewis writes that we have cut out of his soul, long before he is old enough to choose, the possibility of having certain experiences which thinkers of more authority than they have held to be generous, fruitful, and humane. Another little portion of the human heritage has been quietly taken from them before they were old enough to understand. Humans, however, naturally, we instinctually crave an understanding of truth. And so cutting out of our souls this possibility, it leaves a hole which humans will hungrily fill with something else. And in our modern world, I think that we have filled this hole with science. Science has become the foundation for truth in our modern world. When I was in school and in my time as a teacher in New York City, scientific knowledge was presented as inarguable facts, discovered through the watertight process of the scientific method by people much smarter than all of us who are called experts. And our tasks as students, it's not to understand the nature of the scientific knowledge, but to blindly accept the information as truth. And since scientific knowledge is called the truth in our modern world, and since we as humans are starved for truth, we have replaced real truth with science. The problem, however, is that the knowledge we gain about the natural world through the process of science is not objectively true. It is not everlasting and universal. Rather, it is our best explanation of the part of a phenomenon that we can observe. It will never be complete. It can't explain everything, and it is always open to change. In his book, One World, the theoretical physicist turned Anglican priest John Polkinghorne describes science in this manner. Do not all theories in the end prove to be inaccurate and need to be replaced? This view of science is only fatal if we thought that certain truth was our necessary goal. In fact, we will have to be content with the aim of verisimilitude. Our understanding of the physical world will never be total, but it can become more accurate. The result is a tightening grasp of a never completely comprehended reality. End quote. So some of the most influential and famous scientists in history have expressed their accurate understanding of the nature of the information they uncovered. When explaining the limits of his universal law of gravitation, Isaac Newton said, "Gravity explains the motions of the planets, but cannot explain who set the planets in motion." Niels Bohr wrote, "It's wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out what nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about it." And the physicist Richard Feynman once said in a speech to new science teachers, nonetheless, "If you think science is certain, well, that's just an error on your part." The reality is that science can't explain everything about our existence, and no shift in our definitions of truth in the modern world will change that. As Neil Postman writes in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, there is no escaping from ourselves. The human dilemma is as it has always been, and we solve nothing fundamental by cloaking ourselves in technological glory. So it seems as though in our modern world, we have an inverted understanding of the truth. Those truths which are universal and everlasting about human nature have become relative. And the provisional explanations provided by science have become inarguable truths. And as Postman, C.S. Lewis, and countless others have explained, being disconnected from what is really true about ourselves is fundamentally dangerous, no matter how many incredible discoveries science makes. Rather than standing on a solid foundation of real objective truth, we are building our understanding of our world and ourselves on shifting sand. Now, obviously, this is not to say that the knowledge gained through the scientific enterprise is not valid or useful. I love science. I think we all do. We're here because we are passionate about our subjects. Attempting to understand the physical world is an essential part of having a full understanding of the human experience. But science alone is incapable of giving us this full understanding. There's a mathematician named John Lennox who has a really useful analogy to help us see how understanding like both human nature and science can give us a full understanding of the world. So he says it's like a mental experiment. Imagine that there's a pot of water boiling on the stove. And the question posed is, why is the water boiling? Okay, so science can say, well, the water's boiling because the metal pot is conducting heat from the stovetop, and it's heating up the water on the bottom of the pot and causing it to turn into a gas, which is creating the bubbles that we see as boiling. Great. But that scientific explanation can't tell us the full picture of really like why the water is boiling. Because for that, we would need to understand why the person who set the water to boil in the first place did so. So the full understanding or the full answer to this question of why is both the scientific explanation of how energy is transferred to the water, but then also finding out that someone else wants a cup of tea. And for a complete answer to this question, we need both. So prior to discovering classical education, I'd never thought of any of this before. As a public school teacher, I didn't realize it, but I was existing in this box. I didn't know the box existed. And I think that this is a box in which so many people in our modern world also don't realize they're in. And in this box, we have no purpose. We don't understand truth. And we are disconnected from our very own human nature. And this can sound kind of bad, right? This can sound hopeless. And it's so easy to feel discouraged about kind of where we are. And I know I certainly did. Kind of once the box started coming down, it's kind of painful to have your whole worldview crumble to the ground around you. But I don't feel hopeless anymore. And the reason is that I have found classical education. Through my work in my schools and through the people at Hillsdale and through meeting other teachers, I have learned that there is so much good and there is so much to be hopeful for in our modern world. And, now I look back on that box and, now that I know my way out, I want to help as many people as I can also realize that they are in this box. And I want to help them find their ways out too. And I think that as classical educators, we are in a really great position to do just this. So something that I've learned, this is, I didn't know this because of course I didn't learn it when I was getting my master's in education. I didn't know what the root word of education was and what it means until I started teaching classically. It does not mean to forcefully conform students to a particular ideology or worldview, although I know many students in our country would probably argue with this. But the root word of education means to lead out. So as teachers, we need to be finding ways to connect to our students' human nature and the innate curiosity and desire to learn and capacity for joy and ability to understand that is in all of them. We want to guide our students towards an understanding of what is good and true and beautiful and bring out of them their own innate desire for these things. We cannot beat them over the head and tell them what to value or what to think. We must find ways to bring it out of the students themselves. So, as science teachers, it seems like we have quite the task on our hands. So how do we do this? How do we help our students connect to their human nature. And, I'm still learning this myself, but I have found some instructional practices that I think are definitely moving my teaching in the right direction. So what I have is some kind of pieces of advice or some tips as classical teachers of how to start kind of moving our students and our own practice in the direction we need to go. So my first piece of advice is actually, it's not work that we do with our students, but it's work that we have to do with ourselves. And this is non-negotiable. This is really important. This is where we must start. We must, as classical educators, have an accurate understanding of human nature. And we must truly 100% believe in our hearts that our students are capable of learning. I have lost count of the number of times in both my public school career and my career in classical schools where I've heard a teacher in frustration say something along the lines of, well, the kids just don't want to learn today. Or, well, they don't care about learning, so what can I do? And as teachers, we have to eradicate this from our worldview because nothing could be farther from the truth. As classical educators, we must believe Aristotle when he says, all men by nature desire to know. And we must truly, genuinely in our hearts believe this. Our students are human, and thus by nature, they desire to understand their world. Even the students who sit in the back with their heads down, who slouch in their chairs, who never say hi to you when they walk into the classroom, who never do any of the work that you ask them to do, and who try you every step of the way. Even in them, it's very deep down, but they have a desire to learn. And I know it is not easy to avoid falling into these pits of frustration and anger with our most challenging students. But we must first and foremost remember and believe in their human nature, and that it is our duty to try to connect them to it. I think one of the best ways to allow students to realize their ability to wonder and to learn is to guide them to new learning through questioning, often called engaging in Socratic questioning, which is my second piece of advice. So let's talk about what this, leading students to learning through questioning and Socratic questioning, what it means and what it should look like in our classrooms. And I'm going to take this moment to do a quick plug for a professor of education at Hillsdale, Jonathan Gregg. He does incredible work explaining the power of questioning in the classroom. So you should look up his podcast because they will really help you understand what questioning can look like. So essentially the idea with Socratic questioning in our classrooms is that you start the learning in class by asking some type of question aimed at sparking the wonder that's in students. This is a question that will reveal to students what they don't know about something. And then through questioning, you will lead them to the knowledge. So from that spark of wonder to an understanding. And ideally, as the teacher, your role is to just ask question after question after question after question until you arrive with the class at where you want it to go, rather than just giving them the answer. So I'm going to give you an example from a few weeks ago of what this looked like in my 8th grade physics class. So my goal for the day is I wanted them to understand the relationship between speed and distance and time, and to be able to do calculations involving those variables. So to start class off, I gave them a scenario of 2 students racing, and one of them won. And then my question that I posed was, what does it mean to be faster than someone else? And the students were all like, I got this. I am fast. I have raced. I know what fast is. I love cars. They all felt very confident that they knew what being fast meant. And so a student raised his hand, and I was like, yes. And he was like, well, it means you're quicker, duh. And I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, but what does that mean? What does it mean to be quicker? And the student was like, oh, I got this. It means you accelerate more. And I was like, cool, great use of the word, that is a vocab word, accelerate. But what does that mean, right? And so then other kids, were like, oh no, so it just means his muscles are stronger. So he puts more force on the ground. And so he can move faster. I'm like, okay, great. So why? And this went on for 10 minutes. It felt like 100 years. I was like, we're never going to learn anything today. But, Like literally every student in the classroom was like, I got this. And then finally, thank goodness, one of the students mentioned time. And I was like, thank you. But I didn't say good. I said, okay, great. So how can we incorporate time? And so eventually we got to the answer, which is that to be faster in that race meant that you covered the same distance in less time. So we're building this understanding. We arrived at this understanding of the relationship between distance and time and speed, rather than me just giving them the formula and telling them that. I know it might sound like, wow, that was like a lot of time. Don't you have a lot to cover in your curriculum? Yes, I do. But to me, the point is not to cover every single detail. I think it's great if you can do that. But to me, like that experience that the students had, going, learning, seeing how they naturally go from this initial wondering through questioning to an understanding, that's what's important to show them that they can do. Now, is this what my classes look like every day? Definitely not. Sometimes they're a hot mess. Sometimes I ask a question and it just doesn't go kind of the way I want it to. But I think it's important that when we're planning our lessons as science teachers, we need to think about ways that we can lead students to the knowledge that we want them to know. And show them how you get, as humans, isn't it amazing that we can get from this initial wondering to an understanding so naturally? Okay, the third thing we can do as classical science teachers is we can tell the stories of the great scientists in history. This is one of my favorite things to do as a science teacher. And this is powerful on so many levels. So for one, humans love stories. We just naturally engage with well-told stories. Two, hearing the stories of scientists reinforces an accurate understanding of the nature of science and its provisional nature, the provisional nature of scientific knowledge. Three, it becomes clear through these stories that science is a human endeavor and accessible to everyone. And that you don't need a white lab coat and a high-level degree to engage in an understanding of our natural world. Four, it gives students people to look up to who are truly worth admiring, rather than whoever happens to be on TikTok or YouTube that week. But we have to tell these stories right, and we have to tell them fully for students to gain these understandings through stories. So when I teach students biographies, these are like events in my class, and I call them story time. And even my high school kids are like, "Ooh, it's story time!" Like we get really excited. And I spare no detail about the scientist's life. So, for example, we don't just discuss Nikola Tesla's contribution to our understanding of electricity. I start his story time from the night of his birth. According to his mother, it was one of the worst storms that had ever come through their town. And at the stroke of midnight, the very moment that Nikola was born, lightning hit a tree on his property. The midwife who delivered Tesla believed this to be a bad omen and said that he would be a child of darkness. But his mother said, no, he will be a child of light. Now, whether this anecdote actually happened or not, kind of inconsequential, because the kids are at the edge of their seat and they want to know what happens to Nikola next. And as we get farther along in the story, we all marvel together at the fact that the man who illuminated the world was born during an electrical storm. So telling good stories hits right at the humanity of our students. They have sympathy for Gregor Mendel, who struggled with extreme shyness of a child, so much so that he failed his exams to be a teacher. They are so angry when his paper about pea plants was rejected by the scientific community. And they basically lose their minds when they realize that his findings were discovered and adopted as the basis for heredity years after he died, with him never having received credit during his life. They're mad about the injustice of Dmitry Mendeleev, who traveled from his small town in Siberia 1,500 miles over the Ural Mountains in a cart with his mother and sister, and was rejected by every school in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And they are amazed and they are in awe when, as Mendeleev describes, the arrangement of the periodic table came to him in a dream. So telling our students stories allows us to connect students to the humanity in science, and it cultivates an appropriate appreciation for what is worth admiring in our world. We have amazing conversations that incorporate our school virtues and help students start connecting the dots of the big picture we are guiding them towards. The fourth thing we can do as classical science teachers is to accurately discuss the nature of scientific knowledge, truth, the limits of science, and its ever-changing nature. The first unit of my science classes is always a review of the scientific method, and I use this as an opportunity to also discuss these aspects of our discipline. There are many ways to do this, and something I found, I don't know if you all have this, kids love quotes. They just love quotes. So what I'll do is I'll share quotes from famous scientists, and I'll ask students, what is this science saying? What is this scientist saying about science itself? Many of the quotes I shared earlier are quotes I also use with my students. I've had really great conversations about what Bohr meant when he says, "Physics concerns what we can say about it," or what Newton meant when he said, "Science can't explain who set the planets in motion." I especially like discussing another Richard Feynman quote in which he describes science as the belief in the ignorance of experts. Other quotes that help students understand how to make valuable scientific arguments come from similar quotes from Galileo and Kepler. Galileo said, "In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual." And Kepler wrote, "I much prefer the sharpest criticism of a single intelligent man to the thoughtless approval of the masses." Once, after asking the class to summarize what these quotes were saying, a student said, "Well, pretty much they're saying just don't jump on the bandwagon." And another student was like, "Yeah, that is never a good idea." And then I was like, "Well, why? Why isn't it a good idea, especially in science? Why shouldn't we just jump on the bandwagon?" And we have some really great conversations around those ideas. I give them the John Lennox water boiling example, and we discuss other examples of questions that are best answered by science and others that science can't answer. And I always go back to the idea that science is constantly changing. When we are discussing, some scientific knowledge, one of the best examples being the continual development of atomic theory, I always tie it back to what I want them to know them about science, I always tie it back to what I want them to know about science itself. And I ask them something like, well, what does this tell us about the nature of science? And I think it's really important to discuss these ideas with students because they need an accurate understanding of how science can fit into this larger picture of understanding the human experience. The fifth thing we can work on as science teachers is ensuring that we have a meaningful answer when students inevitably ask the question, "Why do I have to learn this?" When I taught in New York, I used to hate it when students asked this question because I took it as them being petulant, and no reason I ever gave them seemed to matter anyway. But now, I love it when students ask this question. I think that when a student asks why, what they're doing is they're searching for meaning. And I think that this is one of the most important things that a human can do. And so we owe them a really good answer to this question. And what is amazing is that as classical educators, we actually have a meaningful purpose to communicate to them. How we express this, though, can be challenging. We must remember, again, that the majority of students and their parents, literally most people, believe that school is utilitarian and that the grade matters above all else. And they cannot be blamed for this. It's the design that has formed attitudes towards education for over a century. So we have to find ways to explain that the reasons we're learning is not for the external carrot reward that we'll get at the end, but for the way the learning will shape your internal mind and heart. And that this is what being a human is really about. We don't want to offer them any gods with little g's. And I really struggled with this for the first couple years as a classical educator. And I think that it's really worth thinking about your answer to this question and talking about it with people. Because how you answer the question of why is one of the most important answers you'll ever give a student. So something I've tried in the beginning of the year, and you're going to be like, I thought you were a science teacher, but I asked students questions about like what kind of life they want to live. And not a materialistic description, but a kind of a more abstract one. So questions like, when you grow up, what kind of relationships do you want to have? What do you want to feel when you wake up in the morning? Do you want to look forward to your day? What do you want people to say about you when you die? And I know this last one might sound morbid, but like the kids are kind of like into it. And many of them are like, wow, I've never been asked questions like this in my life before. And they give me some really good, thoughtful answers. And I ask them to write down their answers and I keep them so that we have a reference for the year when later on a student inevitably will ask why we're doing something. And in response to this question, I've started telling students, this is what I do, and I don't think it's perfect, but it seems to work more than kind of any other why I've given them thus far. But I've started to tell students to like imagine that your mind is a house, and it has like so many different rooms. And in this house, there are all types of like amazing things. We have beautiful furniture and decorations and appliances and stairs. But there's also a lot of really unhelpful things in this house. There's some trash, there's debris, there's locked doors, and there's broken tools. And what learning does is it helps us organize this mind house. And it allows us to orient the useful things in a way that allow them to be used properly, and how to judge what gets in the way of that. So I tell them that like everything we learn adds something valuable to your mind house. And when we practice doing something with the knowledge, when we talk about it or when we write about it, what you're actually doing is you are arranging your mind house so that you can move around it freely. And so that you know what belongs and what should stay out. And so that you can find the right ideas and sentiments for a particular situation. And ultimately find your way to the decisions that will lead you to the type of life you said you want to live. I tell them that the thing is, though, that you are the only person who can arrange your mind house. No one else can do it for you, although people will try. And if you don't start working on it now, later on, it's going to be much harder to understand how to make the choices that will result in you living the life you want to live, the type of life that I know you're striving for. So my final piece of advice, and where I will end this talk, is to remember to be patient and to measure your success as a classical educator only from that which you can control. The reality is that the extent to which students will internalize the understandings to which we try to guide them is ultimately up to them. And honestly, this is the beauty of human nature, that humans can't be controlled and can only be guided towards making, hopefully, the right choices. This can be frustrating as a teacher because, like Sisyphus, it's easy to feel like we work endlessly and never get any results. But the win is not in the results that we can perceive. It is in the certainty that we are doing our best to pull as many people as we can out of the box by staying faithful to and striving for what is good and true and beautiful. This, I believe, is a teaching career and a life well spent. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this lecture, we encourage you to visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu, for additional information on upcoming Hoogland Center events and other free resources for educators.